And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And before we begin, I would love to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territory of the Coast and Semitic speaking people. And as an uninvited guest on these incredible lands, I would love to share that my commitment to reconciliation is to continue to educate myself on the relationship to the land of the Coast-Shamshan people, their language and their culture. And also, as living on this part of Turtle Island, I also educate myself on our shared history. And I can't share enough the wonderful course from the University of Calgary on Corsa that I know many people here have taken. And if you haven't taken it, it's free. And I really encourage you to have a look at that. Thank you, everyone. We will call this meeting to order. And I will pass this over to our Director of Finance, Brittany Verissimo. Thank you.
Thank you. It's just going to be 1 second. We're just adjusting the settings so I can share my presentation with you. All right, so you should be able to see my presentation now. Thank you for attending our annual budget consultation ABC meeting to further discuss our 2023-24 preliminary budget. Here's our agenda for today's meeting. We'll start off with Jerry going through the budget timeline again. Then we'll pass it on to Andrew to go over a summary of our strategic plan priorities, as these are important to keep in mind as we are working on the budget. Next, we'll go over details of budget updates made to services and supplies. Then we'll go over 4 different budget change scenario suggestions for the board to consider. Lastly, Jerry will go over the surplus appropriation. So now I will pass it on to Jerry to go over the budget timeline.
Okay, and you'll probably get used to seeing this slide or similar ones to it. And I always find it's important to let everybody know where we are in the budget process. It's a never-ending process, so it's sometimes hard to know where you are at any given time because it's just there all the time. And the top part of this is talking about the amended budget that starts September 30th when we get our student count, and so we know better what our revenue is going to be, and working through to the board approving it and getting it to the Ministry of Education by the end of February. And that was done earlier this year, and now we're in the preliminary budget process. If you want to advance that, Brittany. The fair bit of planning normally goes through January and February. The middle of March, we get the ministry funding announcement, which happened. Unfortunately, there's still some holes in that we're not totally sure about, and you'll hear about that later. And then we're working towards a board approval by the end of June and sending it into the ministry. So we've done a bunch of the analytical work in January and February, and then now we're bringing that to the board and hearing from other partner groups on the budget as we've got it so far. So, and that's where we're at right now.
Thanks, Jerry. Next, we'll pass it on to Andrew to go over a summary of our strategic plan priorities.
Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, just a reminder with this slide for the trustees that in your discussions that we did work with many of you, and we have some new trustees on the strategic plan. The strategic plan was done with consultation with our partner groups. And so just a reminder that when you're making the final budget decisions in May, that it should be with the focus on these priorities that we have all agreed on. And so equity is, of course, number one. And we find that through our commitment to literacy and numeracy for all of our students. As well, we said that truth and reconciliation was a priority. And of course, we have a 0.5 truth and reconciliation vice principal who works with all staff and all schools. And of course, mental health literacy was certainly one that was identified as a priority for our students and for our staff to some extent, that these are important topics to have a healthy workplace and to have healthy students, both physically and mentally. And that's all I need to review with you on that. Brittany.
Thank you, Andrew. So jumping right into things, now we'll go over our revenue. So you'll be familiar with the layout of the next few slides from our recent budget. This slide shows our revenue change from this year's current amended budget to next year's preliminary budget. I'll go over again what each column means. The first column is the 2023-2024 preliminary budget. The second column is the 2022-2023 amended budget. The third column is the change between the two, showing either the increase or decrease in dollars. And the fourth column is showing the change as a percentage. We went over this in great detail at our last meeting, and no changes to our estimates have been made since then. So I won't go into the details again here. To recap, we are estimating an increase of $620,000 in ministry grants and an increase of $28,000 in investment income due to an increase in interest rates. I'd like to remind you that these are estimates and can change as more information becomes available. This slide shows our expense change from this year's current amended budget to next year's preliminary budget. I'd like to state again that these are estimates and can change as more information becomes available. For example, when we have our actual student count, this could change numbers as student enrollment directly impacts our required teacher FTE. As student enrollment increases or decreases, this could also result in us increasing or decreasing teacher FTE. At this point, since our last budget presentation, no changes have been made to the estimated salary and benefits. The estimated total salary and benefits on this slide is an increase of $209,000 compared to our current year budget. We have made some changes to our services and supplies since our last budget presentation. The estimated total supplies and services is an increase of $218,000 compared to our current year budget. I'll go over these in greater detail on additional slides throughout the presentation. This slide shows a summary breakdown of the different categories in services and supplies and the changes from this year's current amended budget to next year's preliminary budget. You can see on the bottom of this slide the total increase of $218,000 that I just mentioned. Again, this is just an overview, and I'll go into greater detail of these later on in the presentation. Next is an overview of the big picture of where we're at. Currently, we're sitting at an estimated shortfall of $707,000. I'll go through the internally restricted changes and then go into more detail on the supplies and services expense changes. Since our last budget presentation, no changes have been made to our internally restricted estimates. I won't go into great detail again today on these amounts as we went over this at the last meeting. I'll just give a quick recap. The bottom section of this slide is the breakdown of what's included in internally restricted. The first two amounts are the school surplus and the Indigenous education surplus. At this point, we're using the assumption that the school surplus and the Indigenous education surplus that will be carried forward from this year to next year will be the same as this year. This is just the assumption we are using right now. The next two amounts are items we drew from reserves to balance this year's budget. Therefore, we won't have them again for next year. The capital asset purchase budgeted at $60,000 for next year is the purchase of maintenance vehicle. This brings us to our estimated shortfall of $707,000. Again, as I previously mentioned, since our last budget presentation, there have been no changes made to the figures on this slide other than to the supplies and services included in the total expense amount, which we'll be going over later on. So what has changed since our last annual budget consultation meeting? As we mentioned at our last budget meeting, we still have a fair bit of detailed analysis to go through. In particular, for the last meeting, we focused on identifying factors that impacted our operating grant and our staffing. This is because they are by far the biggest components of the budget. Since then, we've analyzed the supplies and services in further detail. In particular, we focused on the spending to date in the current year and forecasted expected costs to the end of the year to come to an estimate of our costs for next year. During this process, we have identified a bit of estimated cost savings, but also additional cost pressures. Some of the larger cost pressures are from an increase in fuel costs, utilities costs, network costs, and maintenance and supplies. As I keep mentioning, I'll go over these changes in greater detail later on in the presentation. As a reminder, when we build our budget, we use estimates. And then as a normal course of business, we check those estimates against actual. We test our budget estimates and assumptions and make adjustments as necessary. And then next I'll pass it on to Jerry to go over the wage increase funding.
Yeah, I just wanted to just chip in on the last slide as well, but the analysis that's that Brittany's been doing since the last meeting could have continued, I think, for another 10 months and not been done. It just never ends. And I was telling her that as soon as I generally presented my budget to the board, I've already got a list of half a dozen items that need to be adjusted when we amend the budget. So it's kind of an ongoing thing as you get better information or find adjustments that you're just constantly making those. And even when you get to year end and you see what your final year results are, that will impact your amended budget as well, as you just have better estimates of the costs that are going in. So and that's part of what's happened then, the changes here. It's just better information. Particularly, we had the actuals at the end of March that we could use to better estimate where we were going to be for next year. Okay, now I'll do my slide. So still unknown, the funding for wage increases provided to the non-unionized staff. Particularly the principals and vice principals are part of that group. We have some district staff as well as your exempt management. And the increases that they get are typically similar to what the unionized staff get. And last year, for the first time in a while, the increase was actually funded by the government. In the past, the boards have had to find that money internally. I think because of the inflation and the size of these increases, the government determined that boards would not be able to absorb those amounts. It's quite a significant amount. For this district, it's about $250,000 for next year, so it's quite sizable. The funding for this, according to the ministry, we won't know until next month whether that's going to be available to us. So that's a very big question mark right now. We don't have that funding in the budget. If that were to be announced that we would be getting it, it would reduce our deficit by approximately $250,000. So it would be very good news to hear that. And it's a shame we don't know that right now because, and we'll talk about this more later on, because you don't want to reduce budgets if that funding is going to show up in May or June. And so we're, anyway, we have a couple of suggestions around that, and we'll talk about that more later on. Next item. It's just a little slide on how we spend each dollar, because generally when we look to cut budgets, most people, first place they look is the smallest pie of all the supplies and services. So 12 cents of every dollar we get goes to supplies and services, and 88 cents goes to salaries and benefits. So the reality is, if we're looking to save some money to make cuts in the budgets, there's no way we can avoid looking at the salaries and benefits section, which means staff reductions. And so that's just wanted to kind of show that, because that is the reality of not trying to find everything by shaving supply budgets. And I think some of the increases we're seeing now in the adjustments is because we've tried to shave those budgets, and it just isn't reality to just do that when you still have to supply those services. So.
Thanks, Jerry. So moving on, so this slide is a summary of the changes from the revenue and expense statements I previously went through. I'll go over these again in further detail in the following 3 slides. Again, since our last budget presentation, there are no changes to these figures other than in the supplies and services expense total. So this slide is a detailed summary of the total changes in revenue and salaries and benefits. The figures on this slide are the total changes from the current year to next year, which we have been discussing. This slide is the same slide we presented at our last budget meeting. I'll recap these changes again. To recap the revenue changes, the Ministry of Education and Child Care grants have an increase of $620,000. The investment income has an estimated increase of $28,000 due to receiving higher interest rates. The salaries and benefits overall changes are due to wage increases, average cost correction, enrollment, and wage continuance. And then just going down the list, wage increase of $1,342,000. In addition to the budgeted wage increase of 5.5%, there was recently announced an additional cost of living increase of 1.25%, bringing the total to an increase of 6.75%. Our current figures include the 5.5% increase, and the additional 1.25% increase will be reflected at our next budget meeting. This will likely not affect our net amount, as we are expecting for it to be funded. Average cost correction decrease of $214,000. The average cost correction is due to when we did an analysis, we discovered that the average cost we used for education assistance was higher than actual costs. If you recall, when we presented the February financials, our EA category was under budget, and we believe that this is the reason for that. Again, as a reminder, when we build our budget, we use estimates, and then as a normal course of business, we check those estimates against actual. This is part of the reason why we do variance analysis. It's not just to see how we're doing financially, but to test our budget estimates and assumptions and to make adjustments as necessary. Next on the list is the enrollment decrease of $170,000. The enrollment decrease is due to an estimated student enrollment decrease, which results in a teacher decrease. This is normal practice. As student enrollment goes up or down, teacher staffing goes up or down. Last on the list is wage continuance decrease of $211,000. Wage continuance was included in this year's budget, but we won't be including it in next year's budget. Next, I'll go over the more detailed breakdown of the supplies and services changes. The changes made in supplies and services is based off known changes from the current year to next year, as well as doing an analysis of actual costs in the current year and reflecting any changes as necessary in next year's budget. Again, the figures on this slide are the total changes from the current year to next year. First, we'll go over the services changes. Since our last budget presentation meeting, changes have only been made to the services budget to snow removal and contract service maintenance, which are bolded and in blue font on this slide. I went over the others at our last budget presentation, but I'll recap them again now, as well as speak to the additions. Trustee elections has a decrease of $12,000. 2022 was an election year, therefore we won't have this cost next year. Audit cost has a decrease of $75,000. This is regarding an audit that the work is scheduled to be completed this year. Therefore, we don't expect to have this cost next year. Legal costs has a decrease of a net amount of $800. We are expecting to have less legal costs next year. Architect cost has a decrease of $60,000. This decrease is because we expect the majority of the architect costs for next year to be allocated to capital projects. This means they'll be included in capital and not an operating expense. Software licensing cost has an increase of $11,800. This increase is due to an increase in the annual renewal cost of our accounting software. We have added snow removal to this list of changes with an estimated increase of $15,000 compared to the current year budget amount. This estimated increase is based off of actual snow removal costs in the current year as well as the prior year, and recognizing that these costs have increased and reflecting that in the budget. We have also added contract services maintenance to this list of changes with an estimated increase of $55,000 compared to the current year budget amount. This increase includes an increase in various costs such as elevator services, boiler and electrical, pest control, etc. Again, this estimated increase is based off a year-to-date analysis of our current year's costs and recognizing that these costs have increased and reflecting that in the budget. This is a result of inflation and the cost pressures resulting from that. Other contracted services costs had a decrease of $65,000. In the current year, this included the Public Development Review PDR for the middle school. We will not have this cost next year. This brings us to a total decrease of $130,000 in services. Next, we'll go over the changes to supplies. Similarly to the previous slide, since our last budget presentation meeting, changes have only been made to the 3 categories which are bolded and in blue font on this side. Sorry, on the supplies category. I'll go through this list and speak to each item. School generated funds has a decrease of $27,000. This is a correction to the current year budget. Grounds maintenance supplies cost has an increase of $10,000. We noticed that the current year budget was inadequate for this year, so we have increased it for next year. Computer equipment cost has an increase of $47,000. This is the next generation network costs that was missed in the current year budget. This is where the ministry has been updating the network capacity for the schools around the province. We have added transportation, fuel, and parts to this list of changes with an estimated increase of $42,000 compared to the current year budget amount. Part of this is due to having an additional bus this year, which increases fuel and cost. Again, this estimated increase is based off of a year-to-date analysis of our current year's cost and recognizing that these costs have increased and reflecting that in the budget. This is a result of inflation and the cost pressures resulting from that. We have also added maintenance and custodial supplies to this list of changes with an estimated increase of $101,000 compared to the current year budget amount. We are considering these costs as non-discretionary. This increase is taken into consideration actual costs required. Once again, this estimated increase is based off a year-to-date analysis of our current year's cost and recognizing that these costs have increased and reflecting that in the budget. This is a result of inflation and cost pressures resulting from that. Going down on the list, rents have an increase of $15,000. That's just due to renewing contracts. Transportation recoveries has a reduction of $32,000. This is a result of our schools now using our new bus to take out of town trips. And so part of that cost is being recovered from the school's budget. And utilities has a cost increase of $100,000. Again, this is just estimated based off a year-to-date analysis of our current year's costs and recognizing that these costs have increased and reflecting that in the budget.
About this now.
Oh, and thank you. It looks like I missed the network. So going back up. Sorry, thank you, Kate. So we also added network costs to this list of changes with an estimated increase of $100,000. This is to purchase switches, which is the infrastructure to keep our systems running. Our computers are currently able to operate at a much higher level than our current infrastructure allows. This upgrade of the network will allow for computers to be able to provide enhanced streaming, video, and educational content for both our students and staff. And sorry, I also missed one-time grants. So this one-time grant has a decrease of $7,000. This was related to a one-time grant for a school in the current year. Hopefully I didn't miss anything else. So this slide is regarding the public and partner group feedback. There are various consultation opportunities where feedback has been received. We had an online survey for the public to submit their feedback and we received 13 responses. We also received 2 public submissions. We also had a meeting dedicated giving our partner groups an opportunity to present their input. The 4 groups that presented were Prince Rupert Principals and Vice Principals Association, Prince Rupert District Teachers Union, School District 52 Indigenous Education Department, and the International Union of Operating Engineers. Budget reduction scenarios. Given that we are required to make some reductions, we have provided 4 suggested scenarios for discussion by the board. As we are waiting for additional information regarding the budget, we ask that you don't make any final decisions tonight and to make the final decision at our next budget meeting. We have generalized the categories in which we have suggested considering changes in. We will not be going into detail tonight on the changes in specific positions. The challenge with going into specific details regarding changes in a public meeting is that it is easy to identify the specific person who might be impacted by the change, given that we are in a small school district. We are suggesting that no decision will be made tonight given that our funding information provided by the ministry is incomplete at this time. And creating unnecessary worry is not the purpose of tonight's meeting. It is important that a proper process is followed prior to that type of information being made public. It is a complicated communications process when changes to staffing are being considered. It is important that trustees, management, union leadership, and the specific employees be made aware of upcoming changes. It is important to treat our staff with respect. At the appropriate stage of the budget process, we will follow established procedures and notify any employees that may be affected. So this slide is our first suggested scenario. It's a reduction with an increase to contingency. I'm just going to briefly go to the next slide and we'll come back to this one. So this next slide is on our surplus policy. I'm just going to read a paragraph taken directly from our surplus policy number 7215. The allocation of surplus towards contingency is a prudent measure which will enable the district to manage unexpected costs and reduce revenue that may arise during the school year. Contingency funds should be maintained at a value between 2% and 4% of the district's operating budget. Just going back to the previous slide. Currently, our contingency is at a 0.45% of our operating budget. This suggested scenario 1 will increase our contingency to 2%. On this slide at the top, we start off with a shortfall of $707,000. Then we add an additional $452,000 to bring our contingency up to 2%. That brings us to a total of $1,159,000 in reductions required. The bottom portion of this slide are the suggested categories to make these reductions in. Again, we have generalized the categories in which we have suggested considering changes in. We will not be going into detail tonight on the changes in specific positions. Going down the list, the suggestions in this scenario are as follows. $395,000 in other staff, non-unionized. To clarify, these include district positions that aren't unionized, and this also includes principals and vice principals. Continuing down the list, $597,000 in teachers staffing, non-enrolling. These are teaching positions that aren't directly required based off student enrollment. No additional changes to services and supplies other than what was previously discussed, and $100,000 in maintenance operating to AFG. To explain this one, we have an increase of $150,000 in AFG for next year, which allows us to allocate some of what would normally be operating maintenance costs to that source of funding. So that's scenario 1. Suggested scenario 2 is a reduction without an increase to contingency. So again, starting up at the top, we have our shortfall of $707,000. Then just going down the list, $553,000 to teaching staff, non-enrolling, $86,000 to support staff, and $100,000 to maintenance operating to AFG. Scenario 3, we are classifying as medium risk. Going down the list again, $707,000 in our shortfall. And then this is assuming that we're going to receive that $250,000 funding for exempt and admin labor increase, which Jerry mentioned earlier. And then just going down the list, $336,000 in teaching staff, $86,000 in support staff, and $100,000 in maintenance operating to AFG. And our fourth and last scenario suggestion, we are considering high risk. At the top, we're starting with our shortfall of $707,000. We're assuming the $250,000 of funding for exempt and admin labor increase. And we're also drawing $124,000 from reserves. The changes involved with this are $249,000 in teaching staff and $100,000 in maintenance and operating to AFG.
If I could just add on that last one, that draw from reserves would mean your reserves were down to 0 at the based on this, so you would have no reserves left. So That's why we're terming this one high risk.
Thanks for that, Jerry. So this next slide is just the scenario overview, just so you can see them all side by side. Okay, just going back 1 second. And now I'm going to pass it over to our chair to open this up for discussion with the board.
But we have one more slide, Brittany.
Sure, yeah, we can do that next then. I'll pass it on to you after this slide.
So the first three columns are what you saw when we did the amended budget. So it shows where our surplus was at the end of last year, what we were utilizing in this year's budget, and what our balances would be at the end of this year. This is budgeted. So a total of 273,000 internally restricted funds, and then we had 124,000 in just reserves unrestricted. So a total of 397,000. So scenario 2 and 3 don't have an impact on the surplus. We're just assuming it's a balanced budget, so it has no impact. However, scenario 1 was suggesting we increase, actually have a surplus so that we could add to our contingency. So that 576,000 you see there is 2% of your operating budget. So that's keeping in line with your policy. The scenario 4 was using, that was our high risk one, where we were utilizing the rest of our reserves. So as you can see there, your contingency or unrestricted surplus is down to 0. So you really got very little left. All that's left is the school surpluses, and then the amount surplus left over from the targeted Indigenous funding. So you really have no safety net in that scenario there. So just wanted to show what that looked like in your, the money in your left in your wallet at the end of the year kind of view. So thanks, Brittany.
Thank you, Jerry. So now I'll pass it on to the chair to open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Jerry and Brittany and Andrew. And questions, comments from the board? Yes, Trustee Pucci.
I understand that obviously it's a tough scenario to predict, but looking at what, since I've come to the board, we have seen a couple months of increases, we've seen a couple months of decreases, student enrollment. We're currently net less than when I started. Is that something we see being the truth behind the next, say, year to 18 months, where we see I would say a nominal decrease of, upwards of 10 to 20 net a season?
Madam Chair, so Trustee Pucci, for the next board meeting, regular board meeting, we'll have a chart showing what the enrollment traditionally does over the year, and it always does kind of, we start out here and then it kind of dips. And we are, we're basing this budget on 1,775 students.
Thank you. That actually answers the question perfectly. Thank you. That is perfect answer. Thank you.
If I could add to that, we do try to be conservative when we look at the enrollments, because it's better to hire staff in September than to have to reduce them. So, if we do get an extra 10 or 20 students, that just makes life a lot easier coming into September. And if we don't, if we are just have the same decline as what we budgeted, then we're prepared for that. So.
Trustee Horn?
Thank you, Chair. Each of the 4 scenarios has a different amount of reduction in teaching staff. Can we get an explanation of why that is?
That's it. Got me?
Sure.
Well, basically, there are certain areas where, as you know, we have contracts with labor, and those were funded by the ministry based on that. But there are positions that are not funded based on that.
Also, maybe these aren't arbitrary numbers either. There's actual, I think we've got about 12 or 15 different reductions that make up each the total of these. And so for example, that 597 in the very first one could be a number of different positions that would be reduced, and somewhat less number of positions in scenario 3. So it's not like we just said, okay, let's take 1% of non-enrolling teaching. It's more specific than that. We just can't share that in a public setting. But yeah, be assured that there's a fair bit of work gone into this. It's not just an arbitrary number, because it could seem that way. I can understand how someone might see it that way.
Thank you.
Trustee Meyer and then trustee Pucci.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding the difference between the scenario 2 and the scenario 3. So my understanding is essentially contingency would say what we have now. But the scenario 3, we assume the funding that we'll get the 250,000, and then that's why there's a difference in the reduction of teaching staff. So that's making up for the 250, right? But that's the only difference between those two?
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. And assuming the funding, this was the same funding that was funded last year, right? Like this was funded, the pay raise, right? The pay raise and benefits.
Yeah, technically this year, but because we're talking about next year, it feels like it's last year. Yeah, we get mixed up all the time.
You're right. Okay, thank you so much.
Sorry, trustee Pucci.
Just a question for operations. Is there or are there any significant assets beyond fleet that are, and what I mean as boilers, HVAC, that kind of stuff that are end of life or end of life within 3 years?
So anything that is end of life that can be funded through a separate, it's not funded through the operating department.
Yeah.
It's funded through a government grant. But there's nothing imminent that's going to collapse on us, but we do have certain projects that we are planning 5 years in advance.
Yeah.
That will.
And that's where I'm just a question based off of the hit and the change to maintenance as well. Okay, thank you.
I have a question for the board. And then I see trustee Horn. Is there any, I'm just curious how the board is feeling about contingency. And also, is there any desire to look at contingency at a less than 2% instead of 2% or nothing? So just a question to the board. I have trustee, is this in relation?
It's a really short question.
Great. I have trustee Pucci.
I'm in of the opinion that a contingency in our operating situation is important. And I am concerned that there isn't another option that doesn't have another value for contingency. I understand that 2% is significant, but we're really shaving thin. And I understand that also means potential people's lives earnings are being affected, but it also means the ability for us to respond is being affected too. So I'm of the opinion that a contingency is an important piece that we have to do.
Trustee Meyer.
So I'm along the same lines as trustee Pucci. I am wondering if something like a scenario between a scenario 2 and a scenario 1, where if it's the assumed funding comes through, that then in scenario 2 that could be put towards contingency, and then we might not be putting 452,000 into our contingency, but maybe just 250. I don't like cutting almost $1.2 million. That makes me ill. but somewhere in the middle, well, it all makes me ill, but something in the middle. But yeah, that's where I stand. Thank you.
Yeah, we presented 4 scenarios. We probably could have done 12. But
No,
that
fair
becomes, so, but there is nothing stopping us from saying, okay, instead of 2%, we use 1%, or we assume half the funding for the non-union staff. So there's ways of mixing and matching some of these. So yeah, by all means, this isn't all set in stone that there's only these 4 scenarios.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna add, we didn't want to overload you, but there's definitely, like Jerry said, you can make changes as you wish. These are just general suggestions.
Perfect. Wonderful. Trustee Horn? You're muted.
Unmute myself. There we go. Sorry about that. I know when we instituted the policy for this contingency of 2%, that it was pushed on us from the government to say everybody should have this X amount of percentage for their budgets. And we've been in a declining enrollment all the time along with this ever since then, and we've never managed to meet this requirement since we engaged it. We know that it's important, and I'm also of the belief that we need some contingency, but I don't see us meeting this again. So I think that that's where I sit on that answer. Thank you.
If Trustee Horn, if I could give you some background on that, the reason the ministry pushed that is because a lot of boards were carrying quite substantial amounts of reserves. And Treasury Board kept saying to the ministry, you keep asking for more money, but the boards are all sitting on these big surpluses. You can't have it both ways. So they, in a lot of consultation, decided we need to have a surplus policy so that we establish, so Treasury Board can see that the boards need, at least a certain percentage of contingency as a safety net. And so that was really just a response to defend the reserves that boards do have to Treasury Board. Obviously, we don't have a problem here defending our reserves to the Treasury Board, but that was the rationale for it anyway. So it wasn't a bad rationale when they were pushing that on us. It did make sense, but I agree it's difficult to have that size. I know coming from Chilliwack that we would love to have a 4% reserve. It just wasn't happening for us.
Thank you, Jerry.
Trustee Pucci?
Maybe I think, because again, these numbers are maybe be abstract, but again, I don't want to put operations on point, but maybe if you could give an example of what $114,000 is that a boiler? Is that less than a boiler?
So, yeah, it's kind of different because a boiler would be funded through grants.
Okay.
But 114,000 would be equal to about 1 3/4 staff members.
Yeah.
Trustee Beal, Trustee Dalton? Thank you. Trustee Beal?
Nothing from me, thanks. I got the picture clearly.
Shall I pass this back to you? Sure. I think the resolution is complete. Wonderful. I would like to thank everybody so much for coming tonight.
And James.
Oh, wonderful. Trustee Horn? Thank you, everybody.
Sorry, I had one more question. So how much danger are we putting ourselves in with the assumption of in scenario 2 and 3 that the funding for exempt and admin labor increase comes along?
Did you say if it does come along or doesn't?
Well, in scenario, sorry, it's 3 and 4 that both have assumed funding for labor increase is paid to us. So how much danger are we putting ourselves in when we assume that in those 2 scenarios?
I guess, and the ministries told me we should know this in the next month. So, ministry doesn't always deliver on things on time. So I don't know. Again, it is a Treasury Board decision. So how much pull they have on that. If we budgeted to have that and it turns around that they didn't, then we would be having to implement some changes very quickly through June probably and into the summer, September, in order to do that. And that presents some challenges with staffing and layoff rules and those kind of things. So it could mean that we could be a little bit overstaffed in September. I don't know all the rules. Every collective agreement's different. But it would mean a bit of a scramble, and it probably means we should be prepared for that in case it does happen. You know, kind of be ready to go if they say, no, we are not getting it, that we're ready to go right away to do that. So the alternative is that could be your contingency, you know, so that you decide to have an increase of 250,000 to your contingency. And that way, if it doesn't happen, you're not scrambling to cut staff, but you're just, so there's those kind of decisions you can make. And that's why we put that in there, that it's a risk, but there are ways of managing that risk possibly as well. So anyway, just some thoughts there around that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. I saw trustee Pucci, but is that what you were thinking
I
as well?
think thing, but I just want to confirm that our current contingency will not cover the 250 currently as is.
And my understanding is that we would budget scenario 2, and that this is just hypothetically. And then if if things did come into play from the government, that 250 would go in as our contingency. Just food for thought, right? We have time to, and Superintendent Samwer?
Right, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, this was one of the reasons why originally this was to be the final meeting for the budget decision, but we took the wise counsel of Brittany and Jerry to say, wait, government has still not given us full commitments, so we really don't have a complete budget for you yet. But if we can just hold on a little bit longer, we'll be able to make much better decisions. And as I say, it's just much easier on staff rather than creating unnecessary worry. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm, just for clarity, is there public questions at this meeting? I can't remember in the past, but I'm thinking not. I think this is just for the board.
It's the board.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board before we call it an evening? Right, thank you absolutely everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you for your commitment to our children and public education. Thank you for spending your time with us. And I believe the next time we're meeting is May 8th or 9th. We will have that for you very soon. And thank you again, everybody. I believe this presentation is available on our website. It will be. This presentation will be available on our website. Thank you all. Have a lovely evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Right.